number 10 will be the Russian madwoman. Always a promising start if mad is in the name. In 18th century Russia, Countess Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova had married a nobleman, but within months he died and left her the wealthiest widow in Moscow. Living in an estate with 800 staff members, 2 sons, and nothing to do, it seems Daria turned to violence to fill the time. She'd punish her staff for every mistake they made, and sometimes they'd even be set up to make these errors intentionally. Then she'd beat them until she got tired of doing it herself and handed it off to another serf to do. After a little bit more of that, her victims would be taken and whipped to death in the stables as she watched. She'd throw logs at the girls because she disapproved of their work, and other victims were stripped nude and tossed out into the Russian winter. Women were pushed from windows, and one was forced to stand neck deep in a pond until she froze to death. She even tormented her victims by pouring boiling water on them. In the summer of 1762, letters by a male serf about the violence and death taking place at Daria's estate reached the Empress Catherine II, who was a normal person and thought nobility wasn't above the law. So she ordered the College of Justice to investigate. Daria was soon arrested and in 1762 was held for 6 years, while authorities conducted a long-winded investigation. Many victims were too fearful of retaliation to give evidence against the Countess, and the Countess herself showed no remorse and nobody could make her confess. In the end, it was found she killed a total of 139 people, but was only charged with 38 deaths since it was all they could prove. Famous evil number 9 is Britain's first serial. The fact that it was a woman? Girl boss moment. Anyways, her name was Mary Ann Cotton, born in 1832. She married at the age of 20 and resettled in Plymouth with her new hubby to start their happily ever after. However, it seems tragedy followed the couple. They have 5 children, yet 4 die of supposed gastric fever and stomach pains. Then her husband dies very suddenly, and Mary relocates to the Northeast. She marries her second husband, who also dies within months. Then Mary moves again and starts seeing widower James Robinson, whom her mother disapproves of, and wouldn't you know it, Mary's mom shows up mysteriously dead in 1866. Robinson had 4 adult children, the same that she used to, from his late wife, and then 2 of which suddenly die soon after they meet Mary. She walks out on him after birthing their daughter, and he's the only husband to survive her. In 1870, Mary married another widower, Frederick Cotton. Soon, Frederick's sister, 2 sons from his previous marriage, and a number of friends died from sudden illness. Frederick himself died in 1871, as did the son he had with Mary, who then quickly remarried, and again, her new husband died after a short illness. When her ex-stepson, Charles Cotton, died suddenly after seeing her in 1872, the press caught wind of a pattern here. Charles Cotton's remains were exhumed, and lo and behold, arsenic is found in the deceased's stomach. Mary was charged with the deaths of 8 of her own offspring, 7 step-ones, her mother, 3 husbands, and a lover, and an inconvenient friend. Her death sentence, however, was botched, and instead of the rope breaking her neck, Mary choked to death for 6 minutes in front of a massive audience. Famous evil number 8 is the serial sisters, Raya and Sakina, the first women to receive the death sentence under the modern Egyptian judicial system. Before they left their village in Tanta for Alexandria, the sisters worked as working girls. Once they moved to Alexandria, though, they started killing, but not out of hatred, just for financial gain. Newsline Mag said it best. The sisters Raya and Sakina Ali Hammam ran several brothels in Alexandria during and after World War I. In 1919 and 1920, they allegedly killed 17 women and stole their gold jewelry, clothes, and money before dismembering and burying them in their own homes. At the time, wealthy women in Egypt didn't put money in banks, preferring to solidify their wealth in the gold jewelry they wore. Stacked bangles, necklaces, ears pierced all the way up to the cartilage, the whole 9 yards. The victims were working girls who used to work in the secret home that was managed by the sisters, or occasionally wealthy market-going women met in town. Most of the victims knew them personally and had even been friends with them for years, and it's this false sense of security that was used to lure the women into one of the 4 homes owned by the sisters, where they'd be plowed full of liquor and substance until a group of men would jump the victim, holding her down and suffocate her with a wet rag. That way they could strip her of her belongings, then bury her beneath the floor tiles. What gets them caught is a dismembered, decaying body found in a ditch nearby, and an arm that washed into a man's plumbing nearby. A police officer already suspicious of the sisters made a report that someone should check their home, and inadvertently saves who knows how many more lives. Following a popularized trial, Raya and Sakini and their husbands were sentenced to death. Famous evil number 7 is the servant of God, otherwise known as Isabella of Castile. She and her husband Ferdinand of Aragon ruled over Spain and brought nothing but pain. Huh? Like that one? Anyways, Isabella and Ferdinand are known for completing the Reconquista, which, if you haven't seen our recent video, Top 10 Scary Women from Medieval Times That'll Give You Nightmares, involved the forced conversion or exile of all Muslim and Jewish subjects, called the Alhambra Decree of 1492. Roughly 200,000 people left Spain against their own volition. Those remaining chose conversion and were subsequently persecuted by the Inquisition, investigating Judaizing conversos, aka most of them ended up being tormented to death anyways. Oh, what else was there? I feel like I'm missing something. Oh yeah, Isabella financed Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492, leading to the discovery of the New World and the death of 250 million indigenous people in North America. Then, those who didn't die were captured, put into forced labor until there was only about 10,000 left, and now running out and needing more forced laborers, Chris and the homies started stealing people from Africa. So yeah, this B word is the reason all that crap could even go down, yet here comes Pope Paul in 1974, opening her cause to beatification, aka the path to being made an effing saint in the Catholic Church. She was also granted the title of Servant of God in the same year for her exceptional job at contributing to the destruction of multiple continents. But hey, Elena Ceausescu earned it. Elena was a megalomaniac B-word. She grew up being a failure, even called a repetente in school, somebody who was too mediocre to move up to the next grade. She met her husband, Nicolae, at a Romanian communist meeting in their 20s, and the nobodies, ironically, were to become Stalinist stars in the country. Nicolae ascended to the general secretary position of the party in 1965 and filled the role with extreme nationalism and monarchical tones. They exaggerated his propaganda, but straight up fudged hers. Elena was made out to be a genius, an innovative scientist with published novels and journals and awards, yet she was an ignorant, backward woman who didn't even know the chemical formulas for water and carbon dioxide. Then, on a visit to the People's Republic of China, she meets and is encouraged by Chairman Mao's wife to take more power. So she does. Elena tramples her husband. In recorded speeches, you can see him double check his every word with her, and she forces him to assign her high-ranking government positions, earning her the nickname Viper from party members. By 1989, Elena was practically running the country through her puppet husband. That same year, at Nicolae's final speech, Elena screams at her own booing subjects to shut up and that she will have them all killed. Well, protesters swarm the party headquarters while Elena and her husband try to escape. They're captured and given a makeshift trial that ends with a death sentence. As they were both tied up and marched over to the wall, Elena could be heard screaming at the soldiers, "Shame on you, shame on you. I raised you like a mother. Why are you doing this?" Elena's final angry words to those fulfilling her sentence were, "You motherfuckers," and she died a foul-mouthed tyrant.
Number 5. Mary the First of England. Born on February 18, 1516, Mary the First held the throne as Queen of England and Ireland from July 1553 until her passing. As the only surviving child of the marriage between Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Mary the First's reign is notable for her brutal persecution of Protestants, earning her infamous moniker Bloody Mary. Her attempt to forcefully return England to Catholicism resulted in the forced passing of numerous prominent Protestants, contributing to a climate of fear and leading around 800 Protestants to flee the country, unable to return until her passing. During her reign, Bloody Mary implemented the heresy laws, which resulted in the burning of over 300 Protestants accused of heresy. Despite the widespread violence, Mary I was never prosecuted for her actions. However, after her passing on November 17, 1558, the winds of change swept through England, ushering away from her staunch Catholic policies. The efforts to re-establish Catholicism were ultimately reversed, marking a turning point in the religious landscape of England. Mary I's reign, entwined with religious strife and political turmoil, remains a complex chapter in history where power, ideology, and the consequences of persecution shape the course of a nation. Number 4. Wu Zetian. Between 665 and 690, Wu Zetian controlled China as empress through her husband, and later as empress dowager through her sons. However, in 690, she achieved a historic milestone by becoming empress, marking her as China's first and only official recognized female ruler. Wu Zetian maintained her authoritarian position from 690 until her passing in 705. Now, despite the significant achievements in expanding China's territory and establishing it as a powerful empire, her reign was unfortunately also marked by violence and bloodshed. Wu Zetian's rise to power was marked by a series of manipulative and ruthless tactics. She orchestrated the downfall of her political rivals, resorting to schemes such as false accusations, purges, anything to eliminate potential threats. While her success in building a powerful empire is acknowledged, she has faced enduring criticism for the ruthless tactics employed to do so. Number 3. Mary Ann Cotton. Mary Ann Cotton, who lived in the 1800s, left behind a criminal tale that's not all neatly documented. Back then, record keeping wasn't the greatest, so we're left with a bit of a puzzle when it comes to the exact details of her evil actions. But it's estimated that Cotton might have offed around 21 people. 3 of them were unlucky husbands, and a whopping 11 were her very own family. She had this not-so-friendly habit of using arsenic to bring their lives to an end, and then cashing in on their life insurance policies. The party came to a screeching halt, however, when she attempted this method on her stepson, Charles Edward Cotton, leading to her capture and the grand finale, a date with the executioner. Now, here's where it gets interesting. They gave her a short rope instead of the customary long one. This meant that instead of physics causing her neck to snap, she instead suffered a long, slow, agonizing suffocation. Number 2, Mary Pearcey. Mary Pearcey, born in 1866, lived in Kentish Town, North London, with her lover, Charles Creighton. Feeling unsatisfied with life, at the age of 24, Mary sought more, leading her to become romantically involved with a man named Frank Hogg. However, it seems that Frank was also already spoken for, being already married to his pregnant wife, Phoebe. The dark events unfolded on October 24th, 1890, when a policeman discovered the almost severed body of a woman in Crossfield Road, Hampstead, along with a blood-stained pram. Mary's association with the crime drew attention when she displayed hysterical behavior at the mortuary while viewing the body of the deceased woman, later identified as Phoebe Hanelo, Frank Hogg's wife. The next day, the lifeless body of Hogg's daughter was found near Finchley Road, a mile away. This time, the cause was suffocation. As the police became more and more aware of the affair between Frank and Mary, they searched Mary's house and found broken furniture and bloodstains. Mary, seemingly unfazed, played the piano and sang loudly during the search. The police ended up uncovering an axe, 2 knives, bloodstained clothing, and love letters between the illicit couple. Mary's attempts to explain the stains as a result of taking out mice was met with understandable skepticism. The police gathered evidence from neighbors who had witnessed Mary wheeling a pram away from the house on the evening of October 24th and heard screams from her residence. The disturbing truth emerged during the trial at the Old Bailey in December 1890. Mary's defense claimed insanity, but it proved unsuccessful, resulting in her sentencing to be sent to hell. On December 23rd, 1890, at Newgate Prison, Mary Pearcey faced execution by hanging, orchestrated by James Barry, just over a decade after her father, Thomas Wheeler, met a similar fate for a similar crime. I guess it kind of runs in the family. Number 1, Delphine LaLaurie. Delphine LaLaurie was a prominent New Orleans socialite who lived during the early 19th century. She's infamously remembered for her role in one of the city's most gruesome and horrifying scandals. Born Mary Delphine McCarty in 1787, LaLaurie married 3 times and became a central figure in New Orleans high society. However, her reputation took a pretty dark turn when her mistreatment of people that she kept forcibly endured came to light. Reports of extreme cruelty and sadistic practices circulated, revealing the disturbing treatment of servants within the LaLaurie mansion. In 1834, a fire at the mansion exposed a hidden chamber where individuals were discovered in appalling conditions, subjected to unimaginable horrors. The shocking revelation sparked public outrage, and Delphine LaLaurie fled the city, leaving behind a legacy of cruelty that continues to haunt the historical narrative of New Orleans.
And let's get into it. Number 10, Myra Hindley. The influence people have in wanting to be accepted by their surroundings is pretty high, especially if they are lonely or more subservient to doing whatever someone asks them to do. In the case of Myra, she's, like a few on this list, is part of that group. Myra Hindley was a notorious English criminal who, along with her partner Ian Brady, was involved in the Moors death in 1960s. Both of their victims were young people and teenagers, and the crimes became known as the Moors deaths because some of the victims' bodies were buried on the Saddleworth Moor near Manchester. The ages of the victims ranged from 10 to 17 years old, and Myra Hindley and Ian Brady were arrested on October 1965. At their trial in 1966, they were convicted of multiple killings. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment. Hindley was also convicted of harboring Brady's knowledge of John Kilbride's deaths, and Myra Hindley spent over 36 years in prison. During her incarceration, she underwent various legal proceedings and appeals, and she consistently maintained that she was a reformed person and sought parole on multiple occasions. In the end, Myra died in prison on November 15, 2002 at the age of 60. Number 9, Carla Homolka. In the 1990s, a Canadian woman who gained notoriety for her involvement in a series of horrific crimes committed alongside her former husband. Homolka's first victim was her own younger sister, Tammy. Just 2 days before Christmas, Tammy Homolka was drugged and harmed by her older sister Anne Bernardo and died after choking on her own vomit. The couple then proceeded to kidnap both Leslie Mahaffey and Christian French before both were horrifically mistreated before they were killed and after Homolka was arrested. She conned the investigators and tricked them into believing that Bernardo was primarily responsible, and she testified against him and was given a very lenient sentence in return, though the videotapes later revealed the extent of the atrocities in which she also participated in. Homolka was released from prison in 2005, and Homolka today lives in a completely different life. She settled comfortably in Quebec, where she is part of a quiet community and even volunteers at a local elementary school. Number 8, Rosemary West. Part of the serial killing couple from the Gloucestershire area of England, Rose and Fred West killed at least 9 young women together throughout the 70s and 80s. After tormenting these people, the West would then kill their victims and bury their remains in a yard and their basement. As a result, their house would later become known as the House of Horrors. Rose West also acted independently and killed her own stepdaughter through Fred. In June of 1971, West was then convicted of 10 homicides in 1995, as well as in 2022, remains in prison. Fred West then also took his own life shortly after being arrested. Number 7, Amelia Dyer. Proving one of the Victorian era's most infamous criminals, Amelia Dyer could be one of the most prolific serial killers in human history. Back in Victorian England, people were paid for adopting babies in a practice known as baby farming. Amelia Dyer would then turn this into her profession and adopted numerous young people. She began by keeping them for a time until they passed of natural causes, but ultimately turned to disposing them shortly after adopting them, thereby keeping the money without having to actually raise them. One of Dyer's victims was found floating in the River Thames on March 30th, 1896, leading to her arrest and eventually execution. While the 6 victims may have been confirmed, it's believed that Dyer may have actually killed up to 400 throughout her life. In one of the most sensational trials of the Victorian period, she was found guilty and later hung. Number 6, Isabella the First. Although they were noted as the Queen Regent of Castile and United Spain, the atrocities they had inflicted onto the world has been noted as an expansion at the hands of so many deaths. Isabella and Fernandad issued the Alhambra Decree in 1492, which resulted in the expulsions of Jews from Spain. This policy, driven by the religious and political motives, has been criticized for its impact on a significant population. She also supported the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, while initially intending to ensure the orthodoxy of converts from Judaism and Islam. It later expanded its scope. The Inquisition was responsible for the persecution, torment, and execution of individuals accused of heresy. As well as her support for Columbus, as we know, led the discovery and eradication of the indigenous of America. Her desire and need of expansion through led to the world where it is today, left a blood trail of civilizations that were already established before they even got their colonial hands on. Number 5, Mary Catherine Hierony, also known as Big Nose Kate, was a historical figure associated with the American Old West, as she was a Hungarian-born adult worker and companion to the legendary lawman and gambler Doc Holliday. Kate eventually moved to West and found herself in a rough and often lawless mining towns of the Old West, as she worked as the Lady of the Night, gained notoriety for her feisty and independent personality. Kate then became romantically involved with John Henry Doc Holliday, a dentist turned gambler and gunfighter. What a career change. They met in Fort Griffin, Texas in 1870s following Doc Holliday's death in 1887. Kate Hierony then lived in various places, including Arizona and Colorado. She then worked as a nurse and a hotel owner in the early 1900s, and Kate moved to Arizona and lived in poverty. She worked in various jobs, including serving as a cook, and then in the 1930s she applied and received a pension for being a widow of a veteran American Indian War. Doc Holliday had happened to serve as a scout. Big Nose Kate then passed away on November 2nd, 1940 in Arizona at the age of 90. She outlived many of the famous figures of the Old West. Number 4, Belle Starr. Born Myra Mabel Shirley, Belle Starr was a notorious figure associated with the American Wild West during the 19th century. She became known as the Bandit Queen and gained notoriety for her associations with various outlaws and her involvement in criminal activities. Belle married several times, with her famous marriage being the outlaw Cole Younger, a former member of the James Younger gang. After Younger, she then married Sam Starr, a Cherokee outlaw, which contributed to her connection with the Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Belle Starr was also known to associate with herself with various outlaws, including Jesse James, the Younger brothers, and the infamous Dalton gang. Her connections to these outlaws and her involvements in horse theft and other illegal activities contributed to her reputation. Belle Starr and her husband Sam Starr lived in the Indian Territory, where they ran a horse ranch, and their ranch became a haven for outlaws seeking refuge from the law. Belle Starr was arrested several times for various offenses, including horse theft. However, she often managed to avoid lengthy imprisonments, and her criminal activities continued. Belle Starr's life came to a violent end when she was shot and killed on February 3rd in 1889 while riding home from a neighbor's house. The circumstances of her death remains somewhat of a mystery, and the identity of the killer was never actually established. Belle Starr's life exploits became part of the Wild West folklore, and over the years, she had been portrayed in many books, films, and television shows, contributing to her enduring legend. Number 3. Etta Place. Etta Place is one of the mysteries of the American Wild West, as her true identity and details of her life pretty much remains uncertain. She was associated with the famous outlaws Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, as we also know them, and is often considered to have been romantically involved with the Sundance Kid. Despite her connections to these historical figures, she is very little known about Etta, as Etta's Place true identity and background are unclear. Her real name and place of birth and details about her early life are not actually known at all, and some historical sources suggest that she may have been born in the United States, while others propose that she could have just been European or South American origin. Etta Place is also best known for her association with Butch Cassidy, aka Robert Leroy Parker, and the Sundance Kid, whose actual name is Harry Alonzo Longabo, and she traveled with them during their exploits in South America, where they sought refuge to escape law enforcement in the United States. In the early 20th century, Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kids, and Etta traveled to South America, where they continued a life of crime, and they are believed to have engaged in bank and train robberies in countries like Argentina and Bolivia. The fate of Etta Place is uncertain, as some theories suggest that she may have perished alongside Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in a shootout with the Bolivian authorities. However, there is actually no conclusive evidence to support this theory, as there may be other theories that Etta Place's true identity, with some speculating that she may have had used multiple names during her lifetime. However, concrete evidence to confirm her background or provide clarity on her true identity is still undiscovered. Number 2. Born in France around 1829, Eleanor Dumont moved from the United States and became involved with the gambling industry known as the Gold Rush. She arrived in California during the Gold Rush of 1850, seeking opportunities in the burgeoning mining towns in 1854. Eleanor ended up opening a gambling establishment in Nevada City, California, where she ran gambling tables and her reputation for her skills as a card dealer. She then became known as Madame Moustache due to the fact that she had distinctive facial hair and refused to remove it despite societal expectations, and over the years, Madame Moustache opened and managed several gambling establishments in various mining towns, including Virginia City and Bodie. Despite her success in the gambling business, Eleanor faced financial challenges and struggled to maintain her enterprises. She suffered major losses and debts that ended up leading to her to a decline in her fortunes, and then Eleanor Dumont's life took a tragic turn, and as in 1879, facing financial difficulties and heartbreak, she took her own life by ingesting an overdose of really intense drugs in Bodie, California. Eleanor Dumont's story proves that a glimpse into the complexities of life during the Gold Rush and the challenges faced by women trying to make a living in a male-dominated society. Her role as a successful gambler and card dealer, as well as her refusal to conform to traditional gender norms, contribute to her place in the history of the American West. The nickname Madame Moustache and her distinctive facial features further add the colorful and unconventional aspects of her life. And finally, number 1, Bonnie Parker was one half of the notorious criminal duo known as Bonnie and Clyde. Alongside Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker gained notoriety during the Great Depression for a series of bank robberies and criminal activities in the early 1930s. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October 1st, 1910 in Rowena, Texas, and she grew up in a working-class family, and despite her small stature, developed a love for poetry and drama. I wonder if that's what caused her to join Clyde, because she joined Clyde Barrow in January 1930. Clyde was already a seasoned criminal, a little bit of spice, little paprika, was serving time in East End Prison Farm in Texas. A mutual acquaintance smuggled a weapon to Clyde, and he used it to escape. Bonnie and Clyde embarked on a crime spree that included bank robberies, burglaries, and car thefts. They were involved in several pew-pew outs with law enforcement, and their criminal exploits attracted significant media attention. Bonnie and Clyde were often a part of criminal gang that included their other associates, such as the Clyde brothers, Buck Barrow and his wife Blanche Barrow. The gang engaged in violent confrontations with law enforcement, resulting in injuries and fatalities on both sides. Bonnie and Clyde gained additional notoriety due to photographs found by police at one of their hideouts, and the images depicted the couple posing with weapons, contributing to their image of glamorous and dangerous criminals. Bonnie and Clyde crime spree came to a violent end on May 23, 1934, when the law enforcement officers ambushed their car near Benville Parish, Louisiana. The officers fired a barrage of bullets, killing both Bonnie and Clyde instantly, and the story of Bonnie and Clyde has become a part of American folklore. Their criminal exploits and romanticized in the media have been a subject of numerous books, films, and songs, and the 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, further cemented their status as infamous figures. It might be too clever to talk about Lizzie Borden as a pun, but I'll ask you guys about that later. Sorry. Anyways, Lizzie Borden was an American woman who was tried and then later acquitted for the axe murderers of her father and stepmother in Massachusetts. Lizzie was very religious and would go to church and do church activities, teaching Sunday school, etc., etc. 3 years later, after her mother passed away, her father remarried to Abby Gray. Lizzie didn't like Abby that much because she suspected Abby's goal was her father's money, and as tensions grew even more when Andrew would gift real estate to his new family's wife and their stepmother received a house. The night before the murder, their uncle visited their father to discuss property transfer, which placed more tension. After the crime was committed, the police turned their attention to Lizzie as she gave conflicting testimonies within the day. And after many strange occurrences, like her cleaning her dress and burning it up saying it was covered in paint, the town's suspicion of her drugging her father to sleep in order to whack him with an axe, overall the evidence was unclear and caused many controversial issues. However, the trial was later pushed away when another axe murderer similar to her father and her stepmom's case occurred 5 days prior. Still, the reputation of Lizzie and her sister's involvement was tarnished, and the suspecting evidence and accounts of that day remains unsolved. Number 9. Ilse Koch. Ilse Koch was a German war criminal who committed atrocities while her husband, Karl Otto Koch, was commanded at the Buchenwald in World War II. Because of the egregiousness of her alleged allegations, and her actions included that she had selected tattooed prisoners for death in order to fashionably create lampshades and other items from their skin. These are fake, by the way, they're not real. Her 1947 U.S. military commission court trial at Dachau received worldwide media attention, as did the testimony of survivors who ascribed her sadistic and perverse acts of violence to Koch, giving rise to her image as her concentration camp murderesses. However, authoritative testimony from numerous witnesses at her post-war trials firmly established that she had made extensive use of slave labor at the camp, had assaulted inmates on several occasions, and had reported inmates to the camp SS for beatings. Beatings that resulted in death on at least one occasion. While imprisoned, she experienced delusions and had become convinced that the concentration camp survivors would abuse her in the cell. She then ended up taking her own life in jail while serving time. Number 8. Belle Gunness. With an estimated 48 deaths at her hand, Belle Gunness poisoned, bludgeoned, and decapitated her victims, all so that she could collect and line her pockets with savings and insurance policies. This lonely hearts killer was known as Lady Bluebeard, amongst other names, luring her victims with newspaper advertisements. Gunness then began meeting wealthy men through a lovelorn column. Her suitors were her next victims, each of whom brought cash to her farm and then disappeared forever, including John Moo, Henry Galdhart, Olaf, Oli B, Andrew, just to name a few. One of the victim's brothers came suspicious, and Gunness's luck seems to be running out. Her farmhouse burnt to the ground, and the smoldering ruins workmen discovered 4 skeletons. 3 were identified as her foster young. However, the 4th, believed to be Gunness, was unexpectedly missing as its skull. After the fire, her victims were unearthed from their shallow graves around the farm. All told, the remains of more than 40 men and minors were exhumed. However, Belle managed to skip out of town before being officially convicted and was never tracked down. Her death has never been confirmed. Number 7. Countess Elizabeth Bathory. I don't know if you've seen the tales of Snow White and how there was this once evil queen who yearned for eternal beauty, but like all fairy tales come from the stem of truth. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman who was an alleged serial killer from the family Bathory, who owned a land in the Kingdom of Hungary. Bathory and 4 of her servants were accused of torturing and killing hundreds of young and old women between 1590 and 1610. During her arrest, it is commonly believed that Bathory was caught in the act of the torture, but the reality was that she was just having dinner. Most of the witnesses testified that she had heard the accusations from others, but did not actually see it themselves. The servants confessed under torture, which is not credible in contemporary proceedings. The accusations of the murder were based on rumors, and as there is no documents to prove that anyone in the area complained about the Countess, in this time period, if someone was harmed, or let's say someone stole something, a letter would be written out as a complaint. Several authors have argued that Elizabeth Bathory was a victim of conspiracy. Similar, during the Salem witch trials, many people insisted that they saw the accused witches of flying through the sky. Clearly neither thing happened and are possibly a form of mass delusion or self-interest lies. Historians are therefore extremely careful in how they treat eyewitness accounts of this sort, given the possibility for collective and self-reinforcing delusions. Number 6. Dorothea Helen Puente. Dorothea Helen Puente was an American convicted serial killer, and in the 1980s she ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California, and murdered various elderly and mentally disabled boarders before cashing their social security checks. She paid each of them monthly spendies, but then kept the remaining for what she claimed were expenses for the boarding house. Puente's boarding house was visited by several parole agents as a result of previous orders for her to stay away from the elderly people and not to handle government checks. Despite these frequent visits, she was never charged with anything. Neighbors began to grow suspicious of Puente when she stated that she adopted a homeless man named Chief to serve as a handyman. She had Chief dig the basement and remove soil and garbage from the property, and Chief then put in a newly concrete slab in the basement before he too mysteriously disappeared. In November 1988, another tenant in Puente's house, Alvaro Montoya, disappeared, and after he failed to show up for his meetings, his social worker reported him missing. Police arrived at Puente's boarding house and began to search the property. They discovered recently disturbed soil and were able to uncover 7 bodies in the yard. When the investigation began, Puente was not considered a suspect, and as soon as the police let her out of their sight, she basically fled to Los Angeles, where she visited a bar and began to talk to an elderly pensioner. The man recognized her from the news, and then he called the police, and she was charged with 9 counts of murder and was sentenced to 2 years of life. She died at the age of 82 and had always insisted all of her tenants died to natural death. Number 5. Amit. Unlike other gods featured in ancient Egyptian religion, Ammit was not worshipped. Instead, Ammit was feared and believed to be a demon rather than a deity. Due to her role as the devourer of the dead during the New Kingdom, deities and demons were differentiated by having a cult or center of worship. Demons in ancient Egyptian religion had supernatural powers and roles, but were ranked below the gods and did not have a place of worship. In this case of Ammit, she was a guardian demon that was tied to a specific place such as the Duat. Their appearance was based on a hybrid of animal or human and was denoted so the dead could recognize them. Guardian demons that appeared as hybrid of animals were an amalgamation of traits meant to be feared and to differentiate them from deities associated with humanity. Instead of Khonsu, who was known as the god of the moon, who during the weighing of the hearts would burn them, he wouldn't be the one devouring the hearts of the dead. It was Ammit, was referred to as the devourer of the dead. Ammit was present during the weighing of the hearts and usually near the scale waiting to learn the results. If the heart of the dead was impure, she would eat the hearts, leaving them soulless and trapped in the Duat. In some ways, she was not necessarily evil, she's just doing her job. Although, she may seem like a good guy since she does eat bad people's hearts, but Ammit was believed to be Anubis' equal, and she wanted to enter the real world to devour the souls of the living, so I guess it just depends on the day. Number 4. Mereneth. Like pretty much all of our ancient lady pharaohs, Mereneth was a shadowy figure. When the dynasty system was still pretty new and being a royal was a very bloody business, her name in itself is extra violent. It comes from Neith, a vicious huntress, one of Egypt's oldest goddess, and one of the fiercest. In the beginning, when they were still sorting out the Egyptian empire, the transition from a recently deceased pharaoh to a new one is a stressful time. And when the king of the dynasty 1 promised his family a place into the afterlife, Mereneth, his daughter, could have been one of them, but instead Mereneth got herself wondering, was she destined to die with her father or to become more powerful than ever? Mereneth ends up marrying with her brother, of course, because this is ancient Egypt, and tries to have royal babies with who might be king one day. And as far as history knows it, being the mother of the king is a more important title that you could win. When her husband brother dies, she was lucky to have a son of that union, so her son is the chosen one, which means she gets to step in and take the seat and make it warm as regent until he's old enough to claim it. In such situations, she isn't a threat, she's there to help protect her son, after all, and thus keeping her lineage from being broken. Mereneth milks that loophole for roughly 6 to 8 years, and her first rule was to pick the people chosen to sacrifice for her husband's funeral. She used this as an opportunity to eliminate people as she saw as threats. Young women and their young would be buried together, and she also uses the opportunity to leave her name all over the tomb as a PR move, highlighting her role as connection between the past and the present kings. And as it's carved into a fine building, then it must be true. This is something Egyptian lady pharaohs would start doing over and over again. Number 3. Tower Set. Her story might be one of ambition and regicide, or one of women being manipulated by an evil puppet master, or it might be both. Her husband was the pharaoh Seti II. Seti II had another queen, but apparently she was too old, and so Tower Set became the second wife. Seti became the pharaoh when he was very old because his father just refused to die, and only carried on until Seti was quite elderly when he finally became the pharaoh. Somehow she ends up being regent, essentially for the next king, who is a young boy named Septa, who has no relationship to her at all. A chancellor named Bey tries to puppet Tower Set and use her as a royal female, but before Septa dies, just a few years later, from health issues due to inbreeding, he gets rid of the chancellor and Tower Set is placed there as his regent. The question of whether or not she's killed the king herself or used the king as a puppet to get rid of Bey is still unknown, but either way, Tower Set takes the reins of Egypt into her hands and she names herself as not queen, but king. She declares herself pharaoh and starts putting her name as pharaohs on every monument. And because Egypt doesn't like removing pharaohs from power, they would just tolerate a lot of chaos from the current pharaoh until the next one comes. But with this belief and accusing Tower Set of getting rid of the last pharaoh puts a lot of tension in the land. She then deals with a contender who challenges to overthrow her, and eventually she is overthrown. But any other record of her is suddenly gone. Tower Set gets blamed by the end of the 19th dynasty, and they see her as a weak leader. They will still accept her as long as she's ruling aside Septa, but as soon as she begins to show ambition and names herself pharaoh, it's utterly intolerable. And remember back in number 9 when I talked about Tabo Tabu, the guy who wrote the literature to warn men about women? He also wrote a story called The Two Brothers, basing off of the reign of Tower Set, which of course is a biased opinion from his point of view. Number 2, Hashput. Egypt becomes a divided country, one at war with Hyksos, a Greek word for invaders from the area now called Palestine. And coming to the throne in 1478 BC, she is thought to be one of the most successful pharaohs. Hashput of Dynasty 18 ruled to maintain the power of her younger nephew, only to have her legacy as female king. The word queen, connotating a mere helpmate, not a ruler, ripped away from her 20-some years after her death when her name and images were erased and smashed. Her great achievements were relabeled for her father or her brother instead, but as a role as regent, Hashput got a taste for power, and it seemed like she wanted more. Hashput decided that she wanted to rule as king herself, not just because of behind the scenes in the name of someone else, but at some point she decided that she would rule alongside her stepson as an equal, or even as his superior, and she wanted the title of pharaoh for herself, which again, even though this is ancient Egypt and women would rule, people didn't like that. Hashput's methods of acquiring and holding onto power suggest a darker side to her reign and character. She had a lover who apparently might be noted as an evil genius, and because of his actions, she was placed in by association. Even though she had a very peaceful rule, her statues were destroyed, and her monuments were defaced, and many of her achievements were ascribed to other pharaohs. Many modern historians attribute this to ritual and religious reasons rather than the personal hostilities as previously thought. Still, Hashput was a successful politician and ruler who thrived in a world dominated by men, and she deserves to be remembered as one of history's greatest female leaders. Number 1. Queen Ty. I've mentioned her before on this channel and how she was the wife of the once famously driven pharaohs led to greatest of Egypt's time, Ramesses III, who famously was the leader at the time of the first labor law strikes in history, with the Egyptians going on strikes against their managers for not paying them on time. So what does this have to do with Queen Ty? Well, aside being his second wife, she was also the mother to Prince Pentawere, who, like most princes, would be competing for the throne. There's still a lot of debate of what conspired the day Ramesses III died, or why it even happened. But there was no doubt that Queen Ty and her son were the headliners to the tragedy bestowed on the pharaoh. Apparently due to the strikes that occurred, the war accumulated by the banks against the sea peoples, King Ramesses III was preoccupied with ensuring the safety and the independence of Egypt. But during this time, noted of his succession was essential to who would take over if he ever passed away. And since Egypt was going through another famine, lack of agricultural funding, and support due to the ongoing wars and strikes, the people were getting frustrated. But eventually, Ramesses was able to sustain it all. But under the eyes of Queen Ty and her selfishness, she didn't like that he wasn't by her side, and her son Prince Pentawere. Instead, Ramesses IV would most likely be the next in line, and still if it wasn't enough to tip over the queen, she hired the pharaoh's harem to conduct spells to repel the guards when he was assassinated. Eventually she was caught, and so was her son, and they were sentenced to not be treated the funeral rites as all the other great kings and queens, but the locations of their bodies remain unknown and unsolved. I know some people on this list may not seem evil to you, but in this era they ruled in, they might have been considered evil for just existing, which is why in history majority have been noting them as evil, and also why there's barely any information. The truth is, in ancient Egypt, if they didn't want to deal with you anymore, they'd erase any memory of you as much as possible, which is pretty much tragic, and even if they couldn't, any other aspect about you would be lost in time. So yeah, maybe some of you guys might say these women on this list wasn't evil, but in ancient Egypt, to them and their enemies, they definitely were.
Wicked woman number 10 is La Quintrala, a pretty sick nickname earned from her flaming red hair. Her true name, however, is Catalina de los Rios Lesperger, and she was a Chilean aristocrat and landowner. The first mention of her name is when her aunt accuses her at the ripe age of 18 of poisoning and killing her own father. Seems to be genetic because her mother killed several people via poison before being sentenced to death for it. Similar to the Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who we'll be covering shortly in this video, Catalina was a violent-tempered woman with a fondness for tormenting her indigenous forced laborers. The situation became so dire that the captive workers revolted and escaped into the mountains. Catalina, however, was crazy loaded, so she easily organized a search party who hunted down the escapees and brought them back to be brutally killed. Besides her forced laborers, Catalina also killed her various lovers and a priest. And like Bathory before her, Catalina used her fabulous wealth to avoid justice for several years, even donating a large portion of her estate to the Catholic Church to keep him off her trail. Eventually, in 1634, Catalina was publicly accused one too many times, and the church's hand was actually forced, only to investigate and find the claims of 40+ killings were substantiated. But she buys her way out. I shit you not, she bought her way out. So she went on killing as usual until 1662, when at the assistance of officials and the public, she was finally jailed. Catalina was getting old at that point, and her health began deteriorating rapidly while awaiting trial, and she dies before she ever sees the courtroom at age 61, which is remarkably old for that time period. Wicked woman number 9 is the She-Wolf of France. Ah, classic. It starts because Isabella of France is married to England's Edward II in 1308 when they were young, gangly, and awkward. As they grew up together, having 4 children and ruling didn't really bring them together, mostly because Edward II is pretty commonly thought to be gay in a modern perspective. He spent every living, breathing second he could with Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh and Isabella hated one another, a physical beard versus a metaphorical one. Want to play house with your boyfriend? That was fine by her, but Hugh was treated by Edward the way a queen would be when Isabella was not. whatnot, and she didn't stand for that shit at all. But then, shocker, 1324, Edward declared war on his bro-in-law Charles IV of France, and add insult to injury, Edward confiscated Isabella's lands and possessions just to ensure she wouldn't show loyalty to her brother while they duked it out. Isabella then had to bounce back and forth between the two men and the countries, negotiating peace and also manipulating the stupid men into getting along. She pulled cunning little tricks like having her son, Edward III, swear loyalty to Charles, producing an unlikely alliance between the French and the English. By that point, Isabella returns to England once more, tired of her now ex-husband's malarkey, and because she wanted to go remove dispenser from Edward II's court that badly, y'all. Her husband refused, naturally, to give up his boy toy, which turned out to be a big fat mistake. So, in 1326, Isabella, who had also found herself a lover of her own named Roger Mortimer, invaded England anyway just to stick it to her ex-husband. Almost immediately, Edward II's popular support crumbled, and Edward III, Isabella's son, became king. Oh, and she did kill Hugh. Isabella was pretty happy about that. Wicked woman number 8 has been name-dropped already. It's the Bloody Countess, aka Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian noblewoman and serial slayer who took hundreds of lives in her own, arguably short one. The woman was raised by her auntie and uncle in a Gothic-style castle said to be riddled with Satanism and the occult, as well as the overlaps of pleasure and pain in the dungeon, if you catch my drift. Anyways, homegirl married this dude named Count Faranik of Nadasi, which sounds pretty vampire-y, and at this point, the teen had already started picking up tormenting people and animals for fun. So much so that rumors say when she moved into her husband's castle, he reportedly built her a torment chamber. Bathory began to pick off the servants, driving needles under nail beds, slicing girls' arms open and dousing them with honey before forcing them to walk outside on a hot summer day to be absconded by bugs. She also would peel back flesh in macabre experiments. After her husband passed in 1604, Bathory's actions became more extreme, finally going after victims people would care about, such as nobility or noticeable members of the community, even with indications that she ate the flesh of her living and dead victims and that she bathed in human blood. In case you couldn't figure it out, she is the inspiration for the famous female vampiress Carmilla. When Bathory went on trial, she was accused of killing 80 people, as that's all they could find evidence of. They knew the woman had killed hundreds, however, and she was found guilty, but instead of being killed, was given house arrest. Wicked woman number 7 is Idra. So, it's unfortunate to say the least, but whether she deserved it or not, Idra of the West Saxons isn't famous for being an evil queen. Maybe it's because she's the sole daughter of the powerful 8th century King Offa of Mercia, the first king of the English, who had nabbed the throne through cold-blooded killing. Offa arranged to marry his very competent and surprisingly well-educated daughter to the King Beorhtric of Wessex in 789, who needed help in fighting off a claim to his throne from a man named Egbert. They do achieve this, and Egbert, hilarious name, is driven into the lap of the court of Charlemagne. Meanwhile, Bishop Asser continues Idbra's story in his Life of King Alfred. So, how it goes is after their marriage, Idbra dominated the crap out of the feeble Beorhtric. She was active in politics, economics, and asserting her own rights. Sure, Beorhtric retained his title as king, but all charters were issued in Offa's name, thanks to his loving daughter. But according to Asser, also a hilarious name, Idbra would allow her husband no confidant. She would denounce anyone he liked or trusted, and if he wouldn't listen and discard them, she simply poisoned them, which worked out fine, until one day the teacups got swapped around Princess Bride style, and her husband drank the poison and died in 802. Now Egbert is recalled and given the throne. In a weird switcheroo, Idbra runs off to Charlemagne's court and tries to curry favor. Instead, he punks her, gives her a covenant, tells herself to get busy running that. Except it ends up being a little like Aubrey Plaza in The Little Hours, and she gets booted out for banging a dude. She would live a life of poverty and misery until her death, wandering the streets of Pavia in northern Italy begging. And speaking of convents, wicked woman number 6 is Heloise. Imagine not even being 20 yet, and you're renowned as the most educated woman in Europe. That was the life of Heloise, a sweet little nun with a big old brain. Then there was Peter Abelard, arguably the most brilliant philosopher of his time, who had already caused an uproar among the intellectual classes. You know a philosopher is good if everyone in their time hates them, let's be honest. And then there's the link in the chain. Heloise's uncle, Fulbert, was a clergyman at the church of Notre Dame in Paris and hired Peter to tutor the girl. However, soon after they met, Heloise and Peter began to exchange amorous glances. Glances that then transformed into soft touches. Peter would later write how he intended to break his lifelong chastity with the student entrusted to him, and so he did. My hand strayed oftener to her bosom than the pages, Peter openly confesses in writing. Our desires left no stage of lovemaking untried, and if love could devise something new, we welcomed it. Hoo-wee! Damn, Peter! I'm not gonna lie, I was like blushing like an MF trying to write that part of the script. Talk about game! Meanwhile, Heloise is thrilled to learn she's pregnant! Hooray! Because a pregnant nun and her older philosopher teacher who seduced her isn't the most disastrous affair that Notre Dame could conceive. In 1118, this couple became the gossip of Paris even after they'd wed. Unfortunately for them, Uncle Fulbert didn't have this kind of tutoring in mind, and so Peter is tragically devoid of his man bits by hired thugs. Apparently, his love center was stored in the, down there, because Peter abandoned Heloise immediately after, who in turn wrote him some epic slam pieces such as, "It would be dearer and more honorable to me to be called your They're gonna bleep that, but it's the one that starts with the W. Ultimately, Heloise became head nun at the Père de la Clette and lived out her days happily there.
Time to leave Russia and talk about Zenobia, the 3rd century queen of the Palmyrene Empire in Syria. Many legends surround her ancestry. She was probably not a commoner, and she married the ruler of the city, Odenathus. Her husband became king in 260, elevating our girl to supreme power in the Near East by defeating the Sasanian Empire of Persia and stabilizing the Roman East. Now, after her husband's assassination, Zenobia became regent of her son Vabalithus and held de facto power throughout his reign. In 270, Zenobia launched an invasion that brought most of the Roman East under her sway and culminated with the annexation of Egypt. By mid-271, her realm extended from Ancyria, central Anatolia, to Upper Egypt, although she remained nominally subordinate to Rome. However, in reaction to the campaign of the Roman Emperor Aurelian in 272, Zenobia declared her son emperor and assumed the title of empress, thus declaring the succession from Rome. The Romans were victorious after heavy fighting. The empress was besieged in her capital and captured by Aurelian, who exiled her to Rome, and that's where she spent the rest of her time. Fredegund of Soissons was queen consort to King Chilperic I, who ruled from 561 to 584 CE. Now, she came from humble beginnings, but quickly rose to a position of power in the small Frankish kingdom. She convinced her husband to leave his first wife and slay his second, ensuring her close relationship with the king was secure. So after all that happened, enter Brunhild. She was the wife of Sigebert I, the king of Austrasia, who was half-brother to Chilperic. This caused a fierce rivalry between the two queens, because she was like, yo, why are you making your husband leave all these people? And they had a lot of death. Wasn't fun. Okay, here's a name everybody should know, Catherine de Medici. It was no new news that Henry II of France had a lifelong affair with his mistress Diane de Poitiers. Well, on his deathbed, he begged his wife, Queen Catherine, to allow him to see her. And the queen was like, yeah, no, Diane's not even coming anywhere near this room. The king died a lonely and painful death without his love by his side. But, okay, that's not what made her a terrible queen. The queen mother had a rebellious daughter named Margaret, who decided to cross the queen, and Catherine was like, I'm gonna get my revenge. She would fight over her married daughter's adultery and affairs. It is said that Catherine's screams could be heard echoing throughout the palace. During one instance, when the queen mother found out about her daughter's new romantic interest, well, she locked her up in the castle and we never saw her ever again. Now look, I do understand that these emotions might have stemmed from the fact that, well, Catherine's husband had a mistress. But she proved herself as one of the worst queens in history when she ordered that her daughter's romantic interest be executed in front of her. So her son, King Henry, was like, okay, that's a bit too much. He had the guy executed, but like not in front of his sister. Alrighty folks, we're ending today with Isabella of France. She had a complicated relationship with her husband, King Edward II of England. The relationship would end over their opposing politics and a breakdown of trust in each other. Edward was known to keep male favorites close to him, often as advisors. Hugh Despencer the Younger became his chamberlain in 1318 and immediately began to push Isabella out of the king's sphere of influence. Edward began to favor Despencer over Isabella to the point where it was like, go do something else. Eventually, Edward faced conflict with King Charles of France, Isabella's brother. Isabella's lands were confiscated and she left for France. After Edward refused to return her land and get rid of Despencer, she and her brother invaded England and deposed the king. Now their son, Edward III, was then named as ruler of England. You know what? After everything else today, killing your husband? It doesn't seem so bad anymore.
Number 10, Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory, commonly referred to as the Blood Countess, occupies a pretty creepy place in history as a Hungarian noblewoman with a notorious reputation. She is believed to be one of the most prolific female serial killers in history, earning her eerie nickname from the gruesome practice of bathing in the red of her victims. This ritual was apparently rooted in her belief that it could preserve her youthfulness, and it sounds like some pretty extreme anti-aging to me. Operating during the late 16th and early 17th centuries within the walls of her castle, now located in modern-day Slovakia, Bathory subjected an estimated 650 girls to unimaginable horrors. Her reign of terror reached its thankful end on December 30th, 1610, when Elizabeth Elizabeth, along with 4 accomplices, faced arrest following an investigation into the disturbing rumors surrounding her actions. Despite the severity of the accusations, though, a lack of concrete evidence prevented the claims from being substantiated. However, the absence of solid proof did not grant her leniency, and she was confined to her castle until her eventual passing. Her evil deeds and the whole blood-soaked castle deal make her a heavyweight in the true crime scene. It's a legitimate horror story with more questions than answers. Would probably make a great horror film, though. And in at number 9 today is Ma Barker. Ma Barker, a notorious figure in US criminal history, served as the leader of the feared Barker gang, which her sons were also a part of. Gaining the title of the FBI's public enemy #1, Barker orchestrated a series of robberies, murders, and kidnappings across the American Midwest in the early 1930s. Her life came to a pretty explosive end in 1935 during a prolonged standoff in her Florida hideout, setting a record as the longest standoff in FBI history. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI's first director, once described her as the most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain of the last decade. Hoover's description added to Ma Barker's mysterious reputation, solidifying her reputation as one of the most evil women of all time. Number 8, Belle Gunness. Belle Gunness holds the disturbing title of one of America's worst female serial killers. Even before considering her terrifying actions, she was already an imposing and physically intimidating woman, standing 6 feet tall and weighing over 200 pounds. It was alleged that she was responsible for the passing of her husbands, younglings, numerous suitors, boyfriends, and even her own daughters, Myrtle and Lucy. Belle's motive was pretty simple: greed. She gained income by stealing life insurance and assets from her victims. Reports suggest her victim count exceeds 20, with some claiming it could be over 100. Inconsistencies in her post-mortem examination, such as the reported height being 2 inches shorter than Belle's 6 feet, contributed to her becoming a figure in American criminal folklore, often compared to a female Bluebeard, because people will make things up and just run with it sometimes. Number 7, Griselda Blanco. Born in 1943, Griselda Blanco, known by her aliases of La Madrina or the Black Widow, emerged as a frightening figure in the criminal underworld. Hailing from Colombia, she etched her name in history as one of the most ruthless and feared queenpins ever known. Blanco's notoriety reached its peak as a key player in the notorious Medellin cartel, a criminal empire synonymous with violence and illicit trade. What sets Blanco apart is her unexpected role as a mentor to none other than Pablo Escobar. However, as fate would have it, their relationship eventually soured, paving the way for a rivalry that would echo through criminal history. Blanco's criminal empire revolved around the transportation of a certain illegal powdery substance from the fields of Colombia to the streets of the United States. This calculated operation, coupled with her alleged involvement in up to 200 people being ushered to the pearly gates, showcased Blanco's audacity and cunning in a male-dominated realm. Her ability to not only navigate but dominate such a perilous environment proved her prowess as a criminal mastermind. Following a stint behind bars, Blanco's life met a chilling end on September 3rd, 2012, when she was wiped out in a hail of lead, leaving a void in the criminal landscape she once ruled. I'm all for girl power, but let's just put that energy somewhere else, shall we? Cool. Number 6, Christiana Edmunds. Christiana Edmunds, also known as the Chocolate Cream Killer, was an English woman with a really disturbing hobby. She would purchase chocolates, lace them with strychnine, a powerful and toxic chemical, and then return them to the shop. Unexpecting customers who bought those chocolates would naturally fall ill. In 1871, a tragic incident occurred when a young person passed away after consuming one of the poisoned chocolates. Now, following this, Edmunds escalated her campaign by sending parcels of her dangerous chocolates to notable individuals. As the police began linking the fatal and damaging outcomes to the chocolates, Edmunds attempted to deflect suspicion by sending parcels to herself in order to mislead the police. How intelligent. Once she was caught, Edmunds was initially sentenced to death, but her punishment was later changed to life imprisonment due to her mental illness.
Famous evil number 5 is Hell's Bells. Belle Gunness was one of America's most productive female killers. Homegirl was 6 foot tall and weighing in at over 200 pounds. She could have been out here competing in Olympic shot put, but she used her brutal strength for different uses. Insurance fraud. She is first married to a candy shop owner, and when the times get tough, she and her husband burn both the shop and their home for quickie insurance payouts. Then her husband dies suddenly from a brain hemorrhage and Belle cashes in. The second husband, married in 1901, doesn't even survive a year. later. Apparently, a meat grinder fell on his head on accident, which worked out perfectly for Belle's dwindling coin pouch. Yet nothing nefarious is proven until after her alleged death. See, Belle's house burns one night in 1908. Inside, the body of the single mother is found alongside that of her offspring. Devastating stuff. But what kind of threw a pin in that was the dismembered feet, hands, and head found in the pig pen, and then the bones all found in the yard. And the buckets of shattered bone dumped in ditches. All told, the remains of more than 40 people of varying age are exhumed. Suitors, boyfriends, suspicious people, etc. Now here comes some mystery for you. Belle's charred corpse doesn't match up with Belle herself. The skeleton was 2 inches shorter than it was supposed to be, and also it's missing its head. Kinda important for identification, don't you think? The man arrested for the arson and deaths, Ray Lamphere, who was also once her accomplice, stated Belle had set up the whole thing as a getaway scheme and skipped town. Famous evil number 4 is the Beast of Belsen. This SS guard was named Irma Grese, and she is one of the worst of the worst. Coming from a poor rural family, she watched her mother die by drinking acid when she learned of her husband's affair. Now left alone with said father, whom she now hated, Irma heard of the BDM, the girls' equivalent of the Yahtzee Boy Scouts, and begged to join. He forbade it, so she waited his ass out till she was 18 and could simply volunteer for guard work. She starts at Ravensbrück and then is transferred to the Big A. Irma had been dealt a bad hand by having such a violent father, and it seemingly rubbed off on her behavior, which isn't an excuse at all. She was cruel, wicked, and patrolled with a whip so she could flog anyone at any time she felt. Apart from being a complete sadist, attacking prisoners and killing them, she was also alleged to have forced intercourse on others, or upon threat of death, make them do it with each other. Yet she's that kind of evil, and it promoted her to the highest rank a lady could get in the SS, senior supervisor. The worst fact written about this woman was she was one of the many party members to request home items, lampshades specifically, be made out of prisoner's skin for her. She owned 3. After the war, she was sentenced to death at the Nuremberg tribunals. Captain Eric Brown, assigned to interrogate some of these people, said that Greece among them was the worst human being I have ever met. Famous evil number 3 is Vampire of Barcelona. So, Enriqueta Marti would have been seen shambling the streets of Barcelona, dressed in rags and smeared with dirt. Don't be fooled, as this was a ruse used to befriend and lure in the hungry off the streets to vanish into the shadows forever. Later on in the day, she returns home to a comfortable house, sheds her costume, dressing like a woman of respectable means and an alls woman. But when night returned, she's a figure of decadence and luxury, visiting casinos to find new clientele to visit her establishment, a brothel that served a certain type of illegal appetite. See, those she stole from the street were forced into her business, and when death came a knocking on their bruised and broken minds and bodies, she would reduce, reuse, recycle, turning her victims into potions and concoctions. See, this horrific woman also pretended to be a witch doctor. She thought the blood, skin, and bones of useful or beautiful people could cure things like tuberculosis, or even go as far as to stop aging or make someone immortal. Then in 1909, the police come up banging on the door following an investigation, and she's arrested for running a brothel, but thanks to her powerful collections, she's off the hook. A few years later, though, she once again is approached by police, and using accusations of keeping chickens in her apartment as an excuse to gain entry, police find 2 people reported missing. Subsequent searches also reveal a sack containing bloody clothes and knives, then another container of 30 small pieces of human bone. After that, they gained access to a locked room and find pitchers and jars containing human remains, along with already prepared medicines ready for sale. And then behind a false wall in that room and in the ceiling, and buried in the gardens, they find the skulls and bones. She was taken into custody but died before reaching trial. Famous evil number 2 is the Bandit Queen. Sometimes when evil is given context, it's not so evil after all. Pretty much no woman on this list received that grace except for Phoolan Devi. Born in 1963, Phoolan was married off young, and her older husband violated and beat her regularly. She would run away only to be forcefully returned to him until he kicked her from his home for not fulfilling wifely duties, and she's exiled from her own village. In 79, she catches a charge for stealing, and her time in jail is also filled with bodily violation and beatings. She began to hate men who harmed women and waited in resentment for her moment to strike. Ironically, it's after her freedom from jail when she's suddenly taken captive by a crime syndicate. One member, Vikram, spares her from being violated by the members and kills the group's leader to ensure her safety. Homegirl falls head over heels right then and there. She joins the group and married Vikram. One night they even hit up her old village so she could publicly slay her old husband in the center of town as a warning. Phoolan became an integral member of this group group. After every successful crime, she would visit the temples nearby and thank the goddess Durga for protection. However, when two previous members return and find Vikram killed the leader, they kill him, and Phoolan escapes with her life, only to once again be jailed, violated, and beaten. When the villagers help her escape, she starts her own crime syndicate, and every crime committed, she funnels money back into poor communities and families. By then, she'd earned the nickname Bandit Queen. 17 months on, 14th of February 1981, she returned to where Vikram had been killed, ready for revenge. Phoolan marched into the village dressed as a police officer, and when she failed to find all the men that she was looking for, she ordered her gang to just line up all the upper caste men in one line and let the ammunition fly. She continued on the warpath for 2 more years until February of 1983 she agreed to surrender to the government under specific conditions. She would only surrender to the Madhya Pradesh police, not UP police. She would lay down her arms only before Durga and the Mahatma Gandhi's pictures. She needed affirmation she wouldn't get the death penalty and that the sentence of the other members of the syndicate wouldn't exceed 8 years, and she also demanded a plot of land for reconciliation and her entire family be escorted by police to the surrender ceremony. The police agreed to everything, and she surrendered and was charged with 48 crimes. Her trial was delayed for 11 years, which she served in prison, and she was finally released on parole in 1994. She actually later joined politics, representing political parties, until she is killed, sadly, outside of her own home in July of 2001 as revenge for the 21 men she killed in the Ben Mai incident. Our last famous evil is the soap maker of Correggio. Born in Montella, Italy in 1894, Leonarda actually did have the tragic life she claimed. She attempted to take her life multiple times in her youth before marrying Raffaele Pansarari against her mother's will, earning her the boot from the family home. So she gets her own home, which is destroyed in 1930 in a Pina earthquake. She lost 17 children before, during, and after this event, which really kicked off a slow and steady mental health decline. When her eldest son chose to leave for the Italian military, she began to truly believe she was cursed. So she did what all potentially cursed people do, hit up a psychic, who tells Leonarda that in her right hand is a prison and in her left is a criminal asylum. Somehow, this created a logic jump that someone was going to do something to her son and earn a place in one of those two buildings. So her superstitions only deepened with time. Becoming dangerously paranoid, she started to believe human sacrifice was the only way to protect her son. Her first victim was a local woman named Faustina, who she invited to her home under some guise. She then gave her a bunch of wine mixed with a bunch of toxins and then killed her with an axe, and the same one she uses to cut her body into pieces. She collected her blood in a basin, dried it, ground it, mixed it with flour, sugar, chocolate, milk, eggs, kneaded into dough, and baked it. To quote her, "I made lots of crunchy tea cakes and served them to the ladies who came to visit." Recipe must have popped off because she killed the next 2 victims the same way and produced more tea cookies. And while she was at it, she used the flesh, a bottle of cologne, and a pot of boiling water to produce what she called some of the most acceptable creamy soap. I gave bars to the neighbors and acquaintances. Leonarda's mistake was that she thought she had done it all perfectly and she couldn't get caught. But somehow police came to know about her. At first she defended herself, but when the police shifted the blame towards her beloved son, she admitted to everything. Leonarda was sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in the criminal asylum. Guess that psychic was legit.
Number 10. Pearl Hart. Pearl Hart was a notorious figure in the American Wild West, known for involvement in a stagecoach robbery. Her life story is often intertwined with the tales of the Old West and the outlaws who sought adventure and fortune during that era. Pearl Hart, whose real name was Pearl Taylor, was born in Canada in 1871, but was later moved to the United States and became involved in various activities including acting and singing. In 1899, Pearl Hart and a companion, Joe Boot, decided to rob a stagecoach in Arizona. The stagecoach was en route from the Globe to Florence, carrying passengers and valuables. The stagecoach robbery did not go as planned, as Pearl Hart and Joe Boot were not experienced criminals, and their attempt was somewhat amateurish. They failed to obtain a significant amount of loot, and after the failed robbery, Pearl and Joe was captured by law enforcement. They were then later arrested and brought to trial, and Pearl Hart and Joe Boot were tried for their crimes. During the trial, Pearl presented herself as a victim of circumstances, arguing that she had committed the robbery due to personal circumstances. She was convicted and sentenced to only 5 years in prison. As for Joe, nobody knows. Pearl Hart's life after her release from prison remains somewhat of a mystery. After serving about 2 years of her sentence, she was released due to good behavior, and Pearl Hart's belief was dramatic stint as a stagecoach robber contributed to her lasting notoriety as the annals of Wild West history. Her story became a part of a lore surrounding outlaws and characteristics of American frontier. Number 9. Laura Bullion was also known as the Rose of the Wild Bunch. She was a female outlaw associated with the Wild Bunch Gang, a notorious group of American outlaws led by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid during the late 19th and early 20th century. Laura Bullion was born in Knickerbocker, Texas in 1876. Her family moved to the mining town of Moab, Utah, where she grew up. Laura Laura became acquainted with the members of the Wild Bunch, including Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and then other notorious outlaws. She developed a romantic relationship with Kid Curry, a member of the gang, and Laura Bullion participated in various criminal activities with the Wild Bunch, including train and bank robberies. She was also known for her sharpshooting skills and her involvement in the gang's illegal enterprises. In 1901, Laura was arrested in St. Louis, Missouri for her involvement in a train robbery. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison but only served about 3, and after her release from prison, Laura Bullion tried to lead a more law-abiding life. She lived under an assumed name in Memphis, Tennessee, working as a housekeeper. Laura Bullion then passed away on December 2nd, 1961 in Memphis, Tennessee, at the age of 85, and her death was largely unnoticed by the public. Number 8, there is a limited historical information about Belle Starr, who is also known as Madame Vestal. She was a figure associated with the American Old West during the late 19th century, particularly in the realms of entertainment and the infamous red light districts of frontier towns. Belle Starr was reportedly an entertainer and an actress who performed in various theatrical productions and shows during the late 1800s. But later in her life, Belle Starr adopted the alias Madame Vestals and became known for her role as Madame, managing establishments and red light districts. These areas were known for housing brothels and establishments that provided various forms of entertainment. During the late 19th century, the American West experienced rapid growth with numerous people seeking fortune and adventures in newly settled areas, as well as red light districts. The presence of the red light districts, saloons, and entertainment venues catered to the needs of this transient population that was very common. Like many individuals associated with the red light districts of the Old West, the details of Belle Starr's life remain somewhat elusive and separating the fact that a legend can be challenging. Nevertheless, figures like Madame Vestals contribute to the colorful and diverse tapestry of the Old West societal history. Number 7, Rose Dunn, also known as the Rose of the Cameron, was a legendary figure associated with the American Old West. Born in 1878, Rose Dunn gained notoriety for her romantic entanglements with outlaws and her involvement in the activities of the Wild Bunch gang. Rose Dunn was also born in Indian Territory, which later became Oklahoma, in 1878. She came from a large family, and her brothers were also known for their involvement in outlaw activities. Rose Dunn then became romantically involved with George Bitter Creek Newcomb, a member of the Wild Bunch gang led by Bill Doolin. The Wild Bunch was notorious for its involvement in train and bank robberies, as we know. In 1895, a shootout occurred in the Dunn family ranch involving lawmen seeking to capture Dunn brothers and their associates. During the confrontation, Rose's brother John Dunn was killed, and her older brother George Dunn was captured after the death of Bitter Creek Newcomb. Rose Dunn then lived more of a settled life, and she married Charles Albert Noble, a farmer, and they had a family. Rose and Charles lived in Cathridge, Missouri. Rose Dunn then passed away on February 5th, 1955 in Parachute, Colorado. Number 6, Sarah Jane Newman was born in Tennessee in 1817 and later moved to Texas. Also known as Sally Skull, was a figure associated with the Texas frontier during the mid-19th century. Her life story involves elements of violence, crime, and romance, contributing to her notoriety in the history of the American West. Sarah married George Washington Skull, a Texan and a participant in the Texan War of Independence. George Skull operated a ferry and owned a ranch in a location known as Skull Crossing in the San Antonio River. The crossing was an important point for travelers and cattle drives, as the Skull family became involved in violent feuds with the Taylor family over land and cattle. This feud escalated and resulted in several killings on both sides, with also casualties in 1867. During the height of the feud, Sally Skull was widowed after her husband George Skull was killed. Following his death, she sought out revenge and killed several members of the Taylor family. And after the killings, Sally Skull was captured and imprisoned. She was definitely tried for the deaths, but was charged were dropped due to insufficient evidence. And after her release, Sally Skull's life became less eventful as she lived in relatively obscurity and passed away in 1888. Number 5, Dagmar Overby. Dagmar Overby was a Danish serial killer who killed, including one of her own, during a 7-year period between 1913 to 1920. Overby was working as a professional caretaker, caring for babies born outside of marriage. Out of all the minors she killed, some were strangled, some were drowned, and the rest buried to death in her mansory heater. The exact number of Overby's victims remain unclear, but it is believed that she may have been responsible for the deaths of at least 25. In March 1921, Overby was sentenced to death in one of the most watched death trials in Danish history. The sentence was later commuted to life in jail, and Overby died in prison in 1929, age 42. Number 4, Daria Saltykova. Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova, also known as the Saltykchika, was a Russian noblewoman who gained infamy for her cruel treatment and deaths of serfs during the 18th century. She became a widow at the age of 25, and after her husband's death in 1755, Saltykova inherited significant wealth and several estates. Saltykova was known for her extreme cruelty and sadistic treatment of her serfs who worked for her on her estates. She then subjected them to physical and psychological harm, including torment and death. Rumors about Saltykova's harmful behavior circulated and complaints were made to authorities. In 1768, Daria Saltykova was arrested arrested and brought to trial. The investigation revealed horrifying details of her crime, including instances of beating, mutilations, and killing of serfs. In 1768, she was sentenced to life imprisonment and perpetual penitence in a convent. Daria Saltykova died in 1801 while still in confinement, and her life and crimes became the subject of legends and stories, illustrating the extreme harm that some members of the Russian nobility inflicted on their serfs. In total, she ended up killing up to 140 people. Number 3, Leonarda Cianciulli. My bad if I messed that up. Also known as the soap maker of Correggio, Leonarda was an Italian serial killer who gained infamy for her gruesome crimes in the 1930s. Leonarda's crime was motivated by a twisted belief in human sacrifice as a means of protecting her children and ensuring their well-being. She believed that her killings would result in turning her victims into soap and tea cakes, and Leonarda's first known killings occurred in 1939 when she killed Faustina Seti, a middle-aged woman whom she had promised to find a husband. She subsequently killed 2 other women, Francesca Salvi and Virginia Cacioppo, using similar methods, and in 1946, Leonarda went to trial for her crimes. She was then found guilty and sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. Leonarda spent her sentence in various prisons and psychiatric institutions where then she died on October 15, 1970. Number 2, Juana Barraza. Born in 1957 to an alcoholic mother, Juana Barraza is a former Mexican professional wrestler and one of the most prolific serial killers in Mexican history. Between 1998 and 2006, Barraza, a remarkable, hefty, and muscular woman, killed between 42 and 48 elderly women. This earned her the nickname the Old Lady Killer, and it was long thought that the killer was a male, and it wasn't until January 2006 when Barraza was arrested fleeing from the home of one of her latest victims. She was found guilty on 16 charges of these crimes and sentenced to 759 years in prison. Considering all of her victims were older women, there is a chance it was due to childhood trauma from her alcoholic mother. She felt the need to take justice into her own hands and kill as many quote-unquote versions of her mother she could find. But of course, this is all speculation, and even if that was the case, whatever her experience was with her mother was a clear indication of her subconscious motive. And finally, number 1, Enriqueta Marti. This Spanish woman is often referred to as a vampire owing to the nature of her crimes. It is generally believed that Marti kidnapped young people off the streets of Barcelona and put them to work in her brothel. It is also believed that Marti killed minors and used their blood and remains in various elixirs, and then she sold these elixirs to the rich, claiming that they would treat dangerous ailments like tuberculosis. 12 victims have been linked to Marti, although it's suspected that she killed many more. However, some historians defend Marti and argue that her crimes weren't as bad or as many as the traditional story suggests. Either way, people had died. All of these women had something in common, and it was their desire and thirst for death, revenge, or just plain sadistic. Number 10, La Mashtu. Now, majority of this list, as I mentioned, we're going to mix it up between goddesses and mortals, tales, and historical figures. But keep in mind, due to the lack of documentation and quick erasure of ancient Egyptian rulers, there's always been a noted lack of consistency in their tales, especially if the ruler didn't like the ruler prior. But in this case, on this part of the list, we'll talk about La Mashtu, an evil Egyptian goddess who would morally get rid of the young. La Mashtu was a demon goddess and hybrid creature associated with the worst of crimes and deeds, and her stories can send chills down one's spine. In every ancient mythology, there is a god, goddess, creature, or a being that is utterly hated by everyone because of how devilish they are. La Mashtu is that being. She was the daughter of the sun god Anu. According to different stories, La Mashtu has different natures, and she is either described as a goddess, a semi-goddess, or an evil female demon. Like Pennywise, she would eat children, but not based off of their fear, but because she felt like it. She was often depicted in association of the lost during pregnancies and was seen as one of the most evil of Egyptian entities. Number 9, Tabubu. In these times, women were still regarded mothers and wives first, although we know in ancient Egypt was one of the few civilizations that allowed some equality between men and women in the sense of political, business, financial, and of course political. In the case of Tabubu, she was a tale used in ancient Egyptian literature as many others as a bias against women. The author of the instruction of Pat Hotep warns males to be careful when approaching females, as the female charms attracts the male. In the words of alliteration in some verses say, "Do not open your heart to your wife. What you have said to her will go to the streets. Do not rejoice in your wife's beauty. Her heart is set on her lover. And what she does with her husband today, she will do with another man tomorrow." And so on. And in translation of modern lingo, basically this man was telling every other dude, like an aggressive dominated podcast, that this woman was for the streets, and Silk Sonic's Smoking Out the Window is now your love life anthem. The hostess Tabubu with female charming is evil and greedy. The female figure embodies the tempting function of goddess of terror, who controls the desire with power of temptation to result in crime and destruction. Tabubu was full of female charm, but she was also a fatal container. In this story, a man named Kamoise was so impressed by Tabubu's beauty that he lost his heart over her, and he knew she was an uptown girl as she was living in her white bread world. Trying to get involved with her formally, she invites him to her house instead, and captured by her beauty, she tells him if she wants to get with her tonight, he must draft a contract first, give all his possessions to her, and make sure that his young have no right to share his possessions with her in the future. Tabubu also asks Kamoise to get rid of his offspring in case they and Tabubu might have a dispute on possession later. And he did. He threw his young out the window, and dogs and cats would eat them as him and Tabubu would spend time alone together drinking wine. Number 8. Sekhmet. She is sometimes referred to in ancient Egyptian texts as she before whom evil trembles, the mistress of the dead, the mauler, or the lady of slaughter. Sekhmet was known to enjoy the taste of blood, and every year on the feast of Hathor and Sekhmet, Egyptians commemorate the saving of mankind by drinking beer stained with pomegranate juice. Sekhmet represented Upper Egypt, while Bastet stood for Lower Egypt. Bastet was the tame, good goddess, while Sekhmet was the bloodthirsty, the chaotic, dangerous, and deity of war and love. With her violent and vicious reputation, it was only logical that she became associated with poor activities. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, there are multiple mentions of Sekhmet as both a constructive and destructive force. If she wasn't happy, she would bring disease to mankind, bringing plague and pestilence, and outbreaks were considered a message or a warning from the goddess. The only thing that prevented her from ending humanity was getting drunk on beer, which had been dyed red as blood. Sekhmet was also later associated with Bastet, Hathor, and Mut. Although it's abundantly clear of Sekhmet's destructive qualities as most Egyptian gods and goddesses, she was also very ambiguous. She was capable of unimaginable cruelties as she had enough power to destroy mankind. She also had a good side though. She was capable of spreading diseases as she also had the antidote for them. Many ancient Egyptians prayed to Sekhmet to help cure or even ward off plagues before they could hit and cause any severe damage. Number 7. Hathor. In association of Sekhmet, who is represented as a lion and goddess, Hathor was a virtuous cow goddess and was also the goddess of war and death, so she was also a brutal and bloody character. In ancient Egypt, there was a myth about Hathor's excessive blood hunt. Hathor, who was in the shape of a lion, as we know as Sekhmet, killed the world and licked them up. She killed without batting an eye and was addicted in ending lives. She indulged herself in it, and she was red all over. Standing in the middle of a blood sea, drank hot blood which she was setting up in foam and couldn't stop. In this myth, Hathor is a terrifying female and homicidal goddess. In quotes, the withdrawal and deprival of love is manifested in her character, which is the negative behavior chosen by the classical woman or great goddess. Her mouth, acting as trespassing symbol of tearing and devouring, is specialized by the dangerous negative goddess. She kills all lives indiscriminately and drinks human blood ceaselessly, as her hunger and thirst can be solved only by killing innumerable amount of humans. The character of this fiend-like goddess, such as being crazy about blood, addiction, and madness, is expressed vividly. Number 6. Nephthys. Like the goddess Nyx, mother of night, mother of sleep, mother of death, Nephthys was also known as the goddess of air and the goddess of death. Nephthys is a funerary Egyptian goddess and one of the first 5 primal gods. She is considered to be a dark goddess opposite to the light of her sister Isis, the goddess of healing and motherhood. Her name also means mistress of the temple enclosure or mistress of the house, and is depicted as a woman with a house on her head. She is known to be a friend of the dead as she guides and cares for them into the afterlife. However, she is also seen as a dark deity opposed to her sister, as she played a key part in the Osiris myth. She transformed herself into the form of her sister Isis to seduce Osiris, and that's how Anubis came to be, the god of death. Osiris was always nice to Nephthys, but because of many relations they both shared, but Nephthys betrayed him. After the evil deed, she felt really bad for being the reason her brother was killed. Isis came to Nephthys for help as she was the goddess of incarnation and death. Nephthys helped Isis bring Osiris back. Nephthys was fairly scary and was feared most of the time, hence the title Goddess of Darkness. She did not spare anyone who did wrong by her, and she is known to take full revenge, not one to give second chances. As Nephthys was the goddess and the protector of the dead, she was very famous among many cults in ancient and later Egypt. She was painted near the mummies in the tombs in hopes that she would help the dead when they woke up. This practice was very widespread and was repeated by many pharaohs. Nephthys was a very important deity of the Egyptian mythological pantheon, and her legacy still lives on. Number 5. Giulia Tofana. Not your typical Chanel number 5, but this too was a femme fatale bottle used by so many women to do one major thing: to get rid of their husbands. By some definitions, definitions, Giulia was a girl's girl. After all, it was the 1600s, and women who had malignant husbands who would physically harm and control them was a rather common issue, and the general rule was that unless your spouse passed away, that was the only time a woman could be granted her freedom. In its creation was associated by none other than Giulia Tofana, who apparently was the ringleader of 6 poisoners in Rome. In order to avoid detection from authorities, they actually used the trade name after St. Nicholas and would sell the poison openly as a cosmetic. They even went ahead and used an image of St. Nicholas over the vials, and St. Nicholas and the vial of poison would be sold, affecting over 600 victims, mostly husbands. The active contents inside the vial was unknown, but it was filled with arsenic, lead, and possibly belladonna. It was colorless, tasteless, and therefore very easy to mix with other substances like wine or water. The poisoning would go unnoticed, and its symptoms would mimic other illnesses that was prominent at the time. First dosage would mimic a cold, the third would be digestive issues, and the fourth was death. It was so effective and helpful that when the poison was used to be in its slow active state, it would give the victims time to assume that they were dying and write a will. And if the provider of the poison changed their mind, an antidote was simply lemon juice and vinegar. Fun fact, Mozart at one point was poisoned using aqua tofana, but apparently he himself started this rumor. And if you knew anything about Mozart, he was the Bugs Bunny level type of troll. Number 4, Bonnie Nettles. As cult leaders go, most women of cult leaders were subject to follow their male counterparts. As for Bonnie Nettles, she was the co-founder and co-leader with Marshall Applewhite of the Heaven's Gate New Religious Movement. Although she was registered as a nurse and was married to a businessman named Joseph Nettles, she actually lived a relatively normal life. However, according to the New York Times, she began attempting to contact deceased spirits by conducting regular seances and came to believe that the 19th century monk named Brother Francis frequently spoke with her and gave her instructions. She also visited multiple fortune tellers who told her that she would soon meet a mysterious man who was tall with light hair and fair complexion, descriptions that were very close to Marshall Applewhite's appearance. It was unclear how they met, but after Nettles did an astrological reading for Applewhite, they had an instant spiritual connection. Nettles and Applewhite established Heaven's Gate together as equals, with Nettles running the group and Applewhite speaking for her. Nettles claimed to have communicated with aliens about the next level and told Applewhite to tell their followers. When Nettles died from cancer, the mass followers of Heaven's Gates would then follow through by culminating to take their own lives in 1997. Number 3, Eileen Wuornos. On a bit recent note, you may or may not have heard in this case in the news, but Eileen Wuornos was a convicted serial killer as she targeted only men as an adult worker. She had up to 7 victims and would target specifically motorists, men who she would meet as a hitchhiker. Her story begins when her mother at the age of 14 married her father at the age of 19. After 2 months of having Eileen, her parents divorced and left her with her alcoholic grandparents who were also malicious in their care. Eileen would then do adult work as a minor once her grandfather kicked her out to live in the woods at the age of 15, and she tried to take her own life multiple times, all failed attempts, and until she met the love of her life, Tyra Moore, in the late 80s is when she would continue a string of crime. While she was incarcerated at the Florida Department of Corrections BCI death row for women, she tried to appeal to the US Supreme Court, which was later denied, and at that point she dismissed her legal counsel and terminated all pending appeals. She would then go off and say, "I killed those men, I robbed them cold as ice, and I'd do it again too. There's no chance in keeping me alive or anything, because I'd kill again. I have hate crawling through my system. I'm so sick of this she's crazy stuff. I've been evaluated so many times. I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." After extreme mistreatments she suffered while imprisoned and the inhumane management given to her by her officers, in her final interview she turned to the interviewer and said, and also paraphrasing due to censorship, "You sabotaged me, society, and the cops and the system. An attacked woman got executed and was used for books and movies and so on." Her final on-camera words were, "Thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass." She was later executed by lethal injection. Number 2, Pearl Fernandez. Again, although this case is one of a very recent event, it still marks as a notable case in the issues that lie in the legal forms, in the protections of minors, and the lack of involvement of CPS. Pearl Fernandez, you may or may not know, was the mother of Gabriel Fernandez, who passed away in Pearl and her boyfriend Usaro's custody. According to The Atlantic, Pearl Fernandez and her boyfriend shot Gabriel with a BB gun, tortured him with pepper spray, beat him with a baseball bat, and forced him to eat cat feces. All injuries pointed to severe psychological and emotional distress endured over a long period of time. It was not one-time event that led to Gabriel's death, it was months of torture. A judge rejected her remorse, stating that Pearl's actions were horrendous and inhumane and nothing short of evil. At her trial, jurors heard how Gabriel was tortured and abused by his mother and her boyfriend after being placed in their care 8 months before his death. Pearl is now serving time at the Central California Women's Facility after being sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Number 1, Jolly Jane. While she definitely was jolly when she committed these crimes, Jane Toppin, nicknamed Jolly Jane, was an American serial killer who was known to have committed 12 murders in Massachusetts between 1895 and 1901. How did she commit these? Well, she was a nurse, and her objective was oddly enough to target patients and their family members. Doctors who hired her thought of her as one of their best nurses, but today psychiatrists say that she was one of the most unusual serial killers in history. She was born and raised in the Boston Female Asylum, where unwanted female children were often abandoned. There she was adopted by Ann Toppin, where she was under foster care until she was 18. At this point, she then pursued nursing at Cambridge Hospital in Boston. It was here where she stated her interest in the patients was ought to be taken care of. She grew emotional attachments to them, and if she really liked them, she would fake their medical documents to force them to stay longer at the hospital. She would then also dose her elderly patients with opium to see how they react with the drugs, and then upping the dosage each time. She would also watch them slowly succumb to their death, and she would also mix different types of poisons with her patients and other drugs to stage a sickness and nurse them back to health. Very similar to the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case, where her mother Dee Dee had a mental illness known as Munch-Austin syndrome by proxy. This mental health condition is basically where a caregiver makes up or causes an illness or injury in a person under their care, such as the young or the elderly adult, or a person who has a disability. Because vulnerable people are the victims, MSBP is a form of multiple harm cases. Jolly Jane also had a masochistic side, as she would even get into the bed of her patients who were suffering until they died. She wasn't caught until she used a metallic-based poison on a victim, which finally sparked an investigation in a court in 1902. Toppan was found guilty, and then she told her attorney that she actually killed more than 100 people and even got in beds with more of her victims.
And when it comes to women in power throughout history, were any of them truly in the wrong, or were the history books just very judgy and biased? Look, my opinion tends to fall towards the latter, so let me know your take in the comments, and let's explore some great historical figures. We're kicking off today with Rani of Jhansi. She was the Maharani consort of the princely state of Jhansi in Maratha Empire from 1843 till 1853, by marriage to the Maharaja Gangadhar Rao Nuarkar. I tried, folks. When the Maharaja died in 1853, the British East India Company, under Governor General Lord Dalhousie, refused to recognize the claim of his adopted heir and annexed Jhansi under the doctrine of lapse. The Indian warrior queen is known for joining the revolution against British oppression in 1857, shortly after they deposed the queen. She led the successful defense of Jhansi against company allies, but in early 1858, Jhansi fell to British forces under the command of Hugh Rose. The Rani managed to escape on horseback and joined the rebels in capturing Gwalior, where they proclaimed Nana Sahib as Peshwa of the revived Maratha Empire. Rani was trained as a horseback rider and sword wielder from a young age and was quick to join the fight for India's freedom. Several slayings of British civilians occurred during this period, and whether or not Rani was involved is disputed. The British certainly believe she oversaw the slayings, and she ultimately perished fighting against them. She died in June of 1858 after being mortally wounded during the British counterattack at Gwalior, and is viewed today as a hero in India against tyranny. So, I don't know if she was necessarily evil, but a woman in power, I like. Here's another lesser known ruler, Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba. She was a Southwest African ruler who ruled as queen of the Umbudu kingdoms. She received military and political training when she was young and demonstrated an aptitude for diffusing political crises as an ambassador to the Portuguese Empire. In 1624, she assumed power over Ndongo after the death of her brother Mbandi, and she ruled during a period of rapid growth of the African slave trade and encroachment by the Portuguese Empire in Southwest Africa. Now, the Portuguese declared war on Ndongo in 1626, and by 1628, the army had been severely depleted and went into exile. In search of allies, she married Mbangala warlord Kazanje. In addition to using Christianity as a diplomatic tool, she adopted Christian customs into her court. So from the 1650s onwards, she increasingly relied on Christian converts at said court. Just as she had done with the Mbangalan culture before, she appropriated aspects of Christian ideology and culture, adding these to her existing court traditions to create a new class of Christian counselors loyal to her. She also began practicing Catholic-inspired rituals, placed crosses in places of high honor in her court, and built many churches across her kingdom. Now, her efforts to convert her people were not without controversy, and some conservative religious figures kind of pushed back against her policies. In response, she empowered her Christian priests to burn the temples and shrines of practitioners who opposed her, in order that they be arrested and turned over to her for trial. Traditionalists were dismissed from her court, after which she sentenced them to public whippings. Several prominent Mbundu and Mbangala priests were sold as slaves to the Portuguese, with Nzinga personally asking that they be shipped overseas. Profits of the sale were then used to furnish a new church. Some of the wanted priests, however, escaped the purge and went into hiding. Look, I was all for her until she forced people to convert to Christianity and then banished them when they didn't. That's where I draw the line. Here's another lady ruler, the Byzantine Empress Irene of Athens, who ruled between 797 to 802 CE. She co-ruled with her son for 2 decades before leading the kingdom by herself. Atta girl. Her son, Emperor Constantine VI, was an unpopular emperor. The mother-son duo was indeed a Greek tragedy. She was an ambitious woman, but she wanted full control of the empire. Like, I don't blame her for that part. Here's how she did it though. With the help of some political allies, she led a conspiracy against her own son. Eventually, they did reconcile, but I'm not done yet. In 786, the public turned against Constantine after he decided to divorce his wife and marry his mistress, and Irene took advantage of that and once again conspired against her son. She ordered his arrest and gouged his eyes out. Like, look, it's a little extreme. Most if not all historians agree that she only blinded him for her own personal selfish political gain, since he wasn't really that bad of an emperor and wasn't doing anything to make any situations worse, so her killing him was kind of pointless. Pun not intended. Her lack of an heir and continued loss of legitimacy is what doomed her. Like, if she had just kidnapped her son and shipped him off somewhere, then historians would probably like her more. Maybe. I'm not so sure how I feel about her. Queen Rana Valona, the first of Madagascar, slayed her way to the crown, and sadly, not in a modern slay, more like a bad slay. Queen Rana Valona was the ruler of Madagascar from 1828 to 1861, and much of what we know about her has been influenced by the opinions of Rana Valona's European contemporaries. They generally condemned her policies and characterized her as a tyrant at best and insane at worst. Still, she was known as a fierce leader who was willing to do anything to protect her crown and kingdom. After her husband, King Radama I, passed, she quickly positioned herself as the new sovereign of the kingdom. She had her uncle executed to protect her position, and some accounts say that she eliminated his mother via extreme hunger in order to keep her from breaking a sacred decree about spilling noblewoman's life source. Now, she pursued a policy of isolationism and self-sufficiency, reducing economic and political ties with European powers, repelling a French attack on the coastal town of Phoolan Point, and taking vigorous measures to eradicate the small but growing Malagasy Christian movement initiated under Radama I by members of the London Missionary Society. She made heavy use of the traditional practice of forced labor as tax payment to complete public works projects and develop a standing army of between 20 to 30,000 Marina soldiers, whom she deployed to pacify outlying regions of the island and further expand the realm. The combination of regular warfare, disease, difficult forced labor, and harsh trials by ordeal using a poisonous nut from the tangena shrub resulted in a high mortality rate among both soldiers and civilians during her 33-year reign, with Madagascar's population reducing from 5 million in 1833 to 2.5 in 1839. I get being ambitious, I get wanting to protect your country, but that's a really bad dip in population. Princess Olga of Kiev burned her political enemies alive while she was queen regent. So there's a lot of mystery surrounding her, and there's a lot of the stories tend to have some holes in them, but what we do know is that she was a Ukrainian princess and the first female ruler in Russian history. She became queen regent in 945 CE after her husband, Igor I, was slain. And since their son was a little too young to rule, they're like, okay, you're queen. One of her first acts was to seek revenge for her husband's demise. So by her orders, the men responsible were captured and executed using scalding water. And she didn't stop there, or else she wouldn't be too memorable. In her fury, she ordered the hundreds of people from the men's tribe to be taken out in retribution for her husband. Some accounts suggest that Olga had the tribe leaders be buried alive, and that she devised a plan to set their entire town on fire. One story suggests that she fooled the tribe leaders by inviting them to a retreat, then locked them in a bathhouse and burned it down. Whatever really happened, and it's not fun, Olga devoted herself to Orthodox Christianity shortly after her vengeance was complete. Despite her past, she eventually became the first person of Russian heritage to receive sainthood from the Orthodox Church. Okay, I get wanting revenge, I do, but there's a line. How about we chat about another notable Russian ruler next? When Catherine the Great first arrived in Russia, no one knew that this relatively unimportant German princess will one day rule all of Russia. She was eventually married to Tsar Paul III, who was an unpopular leader. He had run afoul of the Orthodox Church, and even his own wife wrote in memoirs that he was a feeble-minded drunkard. Oof, not good. Catherine took on a lover, Grigory Orlov, and together they were able to court the country's military leadership and overthrow the husband. She was a talented horseback rider and personally led 14,000 soldiers to depose the Tsar. Afterwards, she donned a male uniform and declared herself the Empress of Russia. Also, she apparently was like a bit of a Luddite. She did not understand the true power of the Industrial Revolution, and she was against introducing machines into Russia. You know, emerging industries. Primarily iron smelting, fabric production, those things that really could make some money. She thought the machines destroyed jobs, and I get it, but oh boy. So this led to a predictable crisis at the end of the 18th century when Russian industries fell way behind their Western competition. Once again, I get it, it's just not a good move.
Wicked Woman number 5 is the Black Widow, another creepy cool nickname. If you haven't seen it already, we talked a little bit about Catherine de Medici in the recent Bumblebee video Top 10 Repulsive Queens with Disturbing Reputations. She's famous for being in a super unhappy arranged marriage where she gets cheated on a bunch despite actually loving her husband, and in turn forces her daughter into an arranged marriage wherein it's the reverse and she hates her husband and involves herself in affairs. Just your classic case of a mother taking her suffering out on her daughter rather than trying to break the cycle. Anywho, Medici is remembered as one of the medieval Europe's most violent women for a different reason other than killing her daughter's lovers in front of her. The Italian noblewoman and queen of France is the mastermind behind the St. Bartholomew's Day mass killing. For those unfamiliar, in August of 1572, a bunch of Catholics get all riled up and organize into a mob that goes and absolutely murks a bunch of the Huguenots, aka French Calvinist Protestants. Apparently, they killed about 20,000 of these people. Wicked woman number 4 is Hereditary. Uh-oh, we got double trouble, my ladies, gents, and different compartments. In the early years of the 14th century, Dowager Queen Joan of Navarre, second wife to King Henry IV of England, was accused of using evil magic to try and kill her stepson. Say the accusation was vague at best, as was her supposed method. Simply put, some dumbass in a crowd pointed a finger at her and said, "That lady tried to kill him in a most evil and terrible manner." And the entire group of men went, yeah, that sounds right, that's right, and then they just toss her in a cell. Ironically, the same stepson she's accused of trying to murk frees her from the cell. However, a few decades go by, and now Joan's stepdaughter-in-law, Duchess Eleanor Cobham, is also accused of using evil magic. This time more seriously though, to kill the King Henry V of England. Yes, every man who was allegedly going to be poisoned was named Henry. Welcome to my hell as a history writer. Eleanor's accusation had a hell of a lot more traction though, as she allegedly had several highly educated members of the clergy use necromancy and other means of sorcery to cause Henry's death. This was crucial because in the early and confusing days of witchcraft, it would have not been credible for Eleanor as a woman, especially of lower birth, to have performed necromancy herself. So what does Eleanor do to seal the courts in her favor? She finds a healer woman previously accused of witchcraft, and instead of admitting to trying to kill the king through magic, Eleanor claims she used the female witch for love potions to conceive a child with her husband. She knows since she was once a mistress before wife, she fits the mold of a loose, emotional woman who would resort to love magic far more readily. The previously accused woman is immediately put to death. Eleanor, meanwhile, gets divorced from her husband and imprisoned for life. On a roll with the witch accusations, wicked woman number 3 is Dame Alice Kyteler. So, this is the story of the first woman in Ireland to receive a witch trial, on the dramatic charges of worshipping the devil, killing multiple husbands, and even intercourse with a demon. So let's get started. Alice marries William Outlaw in 1280 and has a son with him, but her following 3 husbands, they yield no children. However, all men were wealthy and died under undocumented conditions. By the time her 4th husband had died, the stepchildren in the mix were seething. Her wealthy husbands had all bequeathed their fortunes and lands to her, a woman, over them, which in the year 1200 logic was literally implausible. Forgetting the power of the P word, these stepchildren, suspicious of their father's deaths and bitter over their loss of income, became convinced she had access to supernatural powers to dispose of her husbands. Bishop Richard Letteray is super down with this accusation and decides to take it a step further. He accuses Alice, her son, and 10 others of being a group who, to quote, concocted powders and potions mixed in the skull of a decapitated robber, surrounded by candles of human fat and accompanied with horrible incantations that brought illness or death to the innocent Christians. Dame Alice was said to have had a private demon, her incubus, with whom she had adulterous relations to earn her wealth. Did they forget that the husbands gave her wealth? It's not like she... Anyway, never mind. Alice's maid Petronilla was flogged, as was everyone else honestly, on the bishop's orders, but she folded like a punk and publicly confirmed that each of the charges were true. Alice, as the alleged leader of the group, was condemned to burn at the stake by the king's council itself, but it never took place. Alice was a step ahead. She scooped up Petronilla's daughter and fled the country never to be seen again. While Alice escaped the deadly punishment, a host of witch trials took place afterwards thanks to her, and in the end, her maid Petronilla is burned alive. Wicked woman number 2 is Matilda. And no, not the cute bowl cut Matilda from Danny DeVito movie that can heal all childhood wounds. I'm talking about the Matilda who killed at the war game until she destroyed herself, not knowing when to let go. Matilda of Canossa is one of the most powerful women in the Middle Ages and the preemptive political force in medieval Italy. She is best known for her military prowess in defending her lands and the authority of Pope Gregory from the aggression of Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire. When he had become king, he was too young to be efficient, and the papacy had turned to Matilda for protection. All of her siblings and fathers had died, leaving her as heir. She organized peasant battles against anti-popes and personally supervised military operations and expeditions while ably managing the affairs of the state, which included administration over a vast kingdom. But Pope Gregory and Henry had blowout after blowout after blowout, and in the end, Matilda's forced to side with the Pope over her bitter cousin. Decades of war followed, but Matilda holds her own. Following the death of Gregory, victory, Matilda continued to defend the papacy and her reign until finally defeating Henry in a battle personally in 1095, and then losing pretty much all of her power as a result. It was worth it to her, however, and in 1111 she was crowned imperial vicar and vice queen of Italy by Henry. In 1633, hundreds of years after Matilda's passing, her body is actually reburied at St. Peter's Basilica. She's one of only 6 women to receive the honor. And now wicked woman number 1 is Giulia Tofana. Poison's in the name, and baby, it's the game. This will be the most successful lady killer you have ever heard the name of, and I'm talking 100 percentile range when it comes to successful deaths. Best part, she doesn't do the killing herself, and that's how smart ladies avoid catching a charge, at least for a while. Giuliana Tofana killed hundreds of men in the late/post-Middle Age Renaissance Italy when she decided one morning to just turn her makeup business into a poison factory. She specialized in the perfect product, a deadly concoction called aqua tofana, thought to have been laced with arsenic, lead, and of course belladonna. Tofana made it her mission and her business to help aspiring widows live their dream of being rid of husbands. Now, this wasn't some money-making scheme. Well, maybe it was for some of these women. Instead, the reason Tofana got into the game was it was an era of arranged marriages, one that left no possibility of divorces thanks to the church doctrine at the time, which supported and encouraged the fact that once married, husbands had complete control over their wives, and women were able to be completely powerless, facing any punishment, bodily violation, beating, or cruelty their husband saw fit. This meant the only way out of an unhappy union was death. Aqua Tofana provided a quick, discreet solution. Tofana's goal was to keep her poison secret so she could continue to sell the potent concoction. She managed to fool authorities for nearly 50 years with the help of her devoted staff of women. She was careful to only sell products to ladies she knew or women that had been vetted by past clients until one day it all comes crashing down. One dumbass gets cold feet and snitches her plan. Tofana was smart and fled to a church to claim sanctuary, where she remained until the government violated the rules of sanctuary and dragged her out. They tormented the woman for days until she admitted to having contributed to at least 600 deaths. Tofana, alongside her daughter and shop staff, are sentenced to death in Rome.